Hello and welcome to another video. In this one, I'll be showing you a few tips and tricks for adding more color variation to your digital watercolors. I thought I'd start with the source and talk about some traditional watercolor techniques, and then switch over and look at some ways I've found to get similar effects digitally. Then I'll do a little painting of a stylized landscape, putting those techniques into practice. If you'd like to jump straight to that part, I'll insert the timestamp below. One of the hallmarks of traditional watercolors is the ability to get lots of subtle shifts in hue, saturation, and value. One of the ways to do this is by changing the amount of water in your mix. Here I'm painting a graded wash of ultramarine blue, diluting the paint as I go to get a lighter and less saturated color. This is often used for painting skies, landscapes, or anything with soft transitions from dark to light, or vice versa. Another way to get color variation in watercolors is to blend two or more colors together. So here I'm painting a variegated wash between ultramarine blue and quinacridone rose, which creates a nice spectrum of violets in the middle. This is often used to paint sunsets or subjects where you have colors intermixing. You can also paint wet in wet and let paints mix on the paper. So here I'm laying down a flat wash of blue, and then while the wash is still wet, I'm charging in a less diluted mix of rose and letting the two colors bleed and run into each other on the paper. It creates soft edges and subtle variations where the two colors meet. This is often used when painting natural subjects like animals, trees, or flowers. The last technique I'll quickly cover is glazing, or painting wet on dry. Once an area is completely dry, you can layer paint on top of it to darken or tint the color. So here I'm painting over the blue wash with a thin layer of quinacridone rose to create a purplish color. Okay, so now I'm going to switch over to Procreate and see how I can achieve similar effects digitally. So to paint a graded wash, I spent some time playing around with Procreate's default brushes and tweaking their settings. I created a brush that gives me a nice range of light and dark just by varying my pen pressure. This brush is a modified version of the Spectra brush, which you can find in the painting section of the brush library. I'll talk through some of the things I changed, and I'll also make this brush available for free if you want to give it a try. If you're customizing or building a watercolor brush, one of the things you'll want to pay attention to is the brush shape. Since watercolors are a transparent medium, you want a shape that has some transparency built into it, something that appears mostly grayscale in the brush preview. I chose the Spectra brush as my base since it had a nice shape to start with. Next, you want to take a look at the wet mix settings. For watercolors, you typically want a pretty high degree of dilution or water in order to move the paint around in a more fluid way. You might notice that when you turn up dilution, you start to see a kind of stuttering effect. To fix this, I simply changed the rendering mode to uniform blending. Lastly, you want to go into the Apple Pencil section and check the pressure settings. To get the largest range of light and dark, you want to increase either opacity or flow or both. So by selecting a good base shape and adjusting your settings a bit, you can create a brush that gives you this nice, smooth gradation. To create variegated colors in my paintings, I'm going to use a feature called Color Dynamics. This is a brush setting that allows you to shift the hue of your brush stroke as you're laying it down. I've already created a version of my Spectra brush with Color Dynamics turned on, so let's take a look at how it works. When you go to the Color Dynamics tab, you'll see there's a few different sections in here. The one I'm going to focus on is color pressure, because this gives me the most control. Instead of having the color shift randomly, I can trigger it using pen pressure, and I can also choose the color it shifts towards using the secondary color slider. To set the secondary color, you just open the color panel and you'll see there are two swatches in the top right, a primary and a secondary color, which I currently have set to red. So if I start painting with light pressure, the color will be blue, and as I start to kind of bear down and increase the pressure, the color starts shifting towards red, creating some nice neutrals in the middle. This technique works well with contrasting or complementary colors, but it also works well with more subtle color shifts. You can also emulate the charging technique by swirling color into the center of a shape. With color dynamics, you are limited to 2 colors, so if you want to paint a variegated wash of 3 or more colors, you'll need to use a different technique. Let's say I want to paint a sunset. I've selected my modified spectra brush with color dynamics turned on, and for colors I've chosen a sky blue and a yellow, and now I'm just laying down a 2-color variegated wash. If I want to add a 3rd color, what I can do is use my freehand selection tool to select the area where I want the color shift, add some feathering to create a soft edge, and then go to my adjustments. Any of these first few adjustments would work. I'm going to use hue, saturation, and brightness since I think it's the simplest one to use. And now I can shift the color any direction I like. I'm going to shift it towards reddish orange, bump up the saturation a bit, decrease the brightness, and just like that I have a variegated wash from blue to yellow to red. This technique is really versatile and you'll see me using it quite a bit in the practice painting. Lastly, we have glazing. Glazing is the easiest technique to emulate because this is basically the default behavior in Procreate. You'll notice that as I was painting my washes, I didn't lift my pen from the screen. As long as the pen is in contact with the screen, it's like you're working wet into wet. You can move the paint around and manipulate it, but as soon as you lift the pen, it's as though the paint dried immediately, and now you're painting wet on dry. As you can see, I'm getting a darker tone where the two areas overlap. As you can with traditional watercolors, you can modify the hue of the base color by layering on a different color. I mostly use glazing as a way to add shading, which I'll show in the next section. So now I'm going to try and bring those techniques together in this practice painting. This is a stylized landscape I drew with just some simple shapes. We have a setting sun as our light source and a few little details to add interest. I'll also make this sketch available for free if you want to try these techniques out yourself. It's a good way to practice filling in shapes while controlling your pressure and your colors. I've gone ahead and created a color palette for myself, similar to how I would premix and test my colors for a traditional painting. I have a few different shades of green and some warm reddish browns that I'm going to charge in a few places to create the illusion of warm light from that setting sun. So I'm going to start with the sky and lay in a variegated wash. You could also do a graded wash here. I'm going to start with this cerulean blue color and then transition to a reddish orange, and I'm using my Spectra modified brush with color dynamics turned on. I'm starting with light pressure and then increasing the pressure as I go down to bring in the red. I'm painting really loosely around the shapes, but you can also go all the way across and then either layer over the wash or use the eraser tool to cut back the foreground shapes. Now I'm going to create a new layer to paint the trees. For the trees, I'm going to use this modified water bleed brush. This brush serves as my round brush. It has a taper to it so I can paint details more easily. I'm going to load my colors, this mint green as the primary, and then a darker bluish green as the secondary. So I'm just filling in this tree here. My plan is to start with light pressure at the top and then charge in some of the darker color as I get to the lower branches of the tree. Here's where I start introducing some patches of the darker color. This gives the tree more dimensionality and suggests different shades of foliage, some darker leaves, and maybe some newer growth that's lighter. And we can strengthen this effect later if we want, using the adjustment method. I'm going to clean up my borders a bit using the eraser tool. I have it set to the Mercury brush, which has a bit of texture to it. And now I'm going to move on to the next tree. For this one, I'm going to use a light yellow-green and a sort of raw sienna color as my secondary. So again, I'm starting with light pressure, laying in some of the green color, and then on the right side of the tree, I'm going to start charging in some of that sienna color to mimic the sun hitting the tree. And I'm just using the eraser to carve out the branches of the tree. If I were painting traditionally, I would have had to kind of paint around these branches or mask them out beforehand. Okay, so for the last tree, I'm again loading up my colors, choosing a slightly different green and orange. You might notice that the colors are turning out a bit light. This is due to the fact that I'm using brushes with a high degree of opacity and dilution. So I'm going to open up curves and adjust it a bit, and you'll see me do this again later on. Now I'm really just fine-tuning and adding a few additional highlights and color shifts here and there, thinking about how I can add more color interest and dimensionality to my painting. The nice thing about digital watercolors is that you can continue to tweak and make little adjustments to it, whereas with traditional watercolors, you risk overworking and potentially disturbing the layers of paint. Here, I'm using the glazing method to darken my values. I have the wet glaze brush selected. It's one of the default brushes in the water section, and I'm just using light pressure to add some shading to the right side of the tree. Now I'm going to paint in the details, add some finishing touches, some shadows, and a bit of texture using some of the techniques I showed in my previous watercolor video. And here's the final painting. I hope you enjoyed seeing this process and learning some ways to add color variation to your digital watercolors. please drop a like if you want to see more of this type of video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!